When you buy your first home, you think you're buying freedom. No more landlords, no more restrictions, just a space that's entirely yours. I thought the same when I bought mine. Cedar Ridge was supposed to be the escape. I had been waiting for peaceful streets, a quiet neighborhood, and a house I could call my own. But little did I know, freedom comes at a price. And for me, that price came in the form of Carol Hartman, the HOA president, self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood. I always thought homeowners associations were about maintaining a sense of order, but Carol, she was a dictator, hiding behind rules, using them as a weapon to control everything. I never asked for her rules. I didn't sign anything to join her little club, but somehow in her eyes, I owed her my life, my privacy, my freedom, and that's when the battle started. This wasn't just about a fence or a fine or a bunch of ridiculous rules. This was about fighting for what's mine. What would you do when someone tries to take everything you've worked for just because they can? Jake Turner had spent years dreaming of owning a home, a space that was entirely his. After living in various apartments for what felt like a lifetime, he was finally in the position to buy. When he found his house in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Cedar Ridge, just outside Denver, Colorado, it felt like his dream had come true. The house was perfect. A modest two-story home with a big backyard ideal for barbecues, family gatherings, and the quiet life he'd imagined. He'd bought it with the intention of making it a sanctuary, a place free from the restrictions that came with renting. No more landlords, no more arbitrary rules, just freedom. For the first few months, everything went as expected. The neighborhood was peaceful, the neighbors friendly, and Jake was able to host a few small gatherings with friends without any issues. He thought he'd found the perfect spot, but that feeling of security was quickly shattered by an unexpected intruder, Carol Hartman, the president of the HOA, Homeowners Association. Carol was the self-appointed gatekeeper of Cedar Ridge, and she made it clear from the start that she viewed her role as more than just a duty. It was her mission to enforce order, harmony, and conformity no matter the cost. Jake had barely settled in before her first complaint appeared in his mailbox. Please, repaint your fence to maintain neighborhood aesthetic. Jake thought it was a joke at first, but when the second letter came, he realized this was serious. It was followed by another, this time concerning the color of his curtains, which had been deemed too bold for the HOA standards. At first, Jake brushed it off, thinking they're just doing their job, but that changed. When Carol showed up at his door one afternoon, it was an ordinary Wednesday when Jake heard a sharp knock at his door. He opened it to find Carol standing there with her clipboard flanked by two other board members, who looked just as stern. "Good afternoon, Jake," Carol said with a tight smile, her eyes scanning the yard like a hawk. "I'm afraid we need to talk about your guest policy, Jake asked, feeling his irritation rise. "I've had a few friends over, that's all." Jake felt his blood pressure rise. This was not what he had signed up for. He hadn't agreed to any HOA rules when he bought his home. He'd never even heard of these absurd guest policies. Yet here she was, trying to dictate how he could live in his own house. "I never agreed to any of this, Carol," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not part of the HOA. You don't get to control me or my guests." Carol's smile twisted into something more sinister. "You don't need to agree to anything, Jake. You live in a community, and the community's well-being comes first. Don't make this difficult." As she turned to leave, Jake's mind was already racing. This isn't just about a barbecue. This is about control. He had spent years working hard to buy this house, and now he was being told how to live in it by someone who clearly enjoyed wielding power over others. The idea of this woman walking in and dictating his life was unbearable. He slammed the door behind her, fists clenched. He had to do something. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. This was a battle for his freedom. He wasn't going to let this HOA dictator push him around. Jake stood on his front porch staring at the fine, in his hand $500 for having guests over. He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. He had lived in Cedar Ridge for over a year now, and until Carol showed up, his life had been exactly what he wanted it to be: quiet, free, and peaceful. But now his own home felt like a prison. Carol wasn't just some HOA president enforcing rules. She had turned the entire community into a place of fear. Jake thought about his phone call with her earlier, the way she had spoken with such certainty, as if she controlled everything. Her words were final, and he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. The next day, Jake found himself in the office of Mike Stevens, a local attorney who specialized in property rights. Mike had been a friend of his father's, and Jake knew he could trust him. As soon as Mike read through the fine, his expression turned serious. "This is a shakedown, Jake," Mike said, leaning back in his chair. "They're trying to force you into submission. The HOA has no legal ground to impose fines on you if you haven't voluntarily agreed to their terms. You don't owe them a thing." Jake's frustration boiled over. "So would I just ignore it, let her walk all over me? What if they come back with a bigger fine? Or worse?" Mike smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. "You're not going to fight fire with fire. You're going to fight it with the law. I'll help you take this to court, but we need to build a case. Gather your evidence. Record. Everything. We're going to expose this." The next week, Jake hosted a gathering, not just a barbecue, but a community meeting, inviting everyone who had been affected by Carol's overreach. Mike the lawyer was there, ready to explain the legalities of the situation and help them understand how they could fight back together. As neighbors shared their stories, Jake realized just how deep Carol's influence ran. She had fined a disabled war veteran for parking his car in his own driveway, deeming it an eyesore. She had even tried to evict a single mother who had put up a Halloween decoration without permission. Carol's actions weren't about rules. They were about control, about crushing anyone who didn't conform to her twisted vision of how the neighborhood should be. The community meeting was a turning point. For the first time, people were speaking out. Finding strength in numbers, Jake wasn't alone anymore. He had a support system, and with Mike by his side, they were ready to take the fight to Carol. But Jake knew it wouldn't be easy. Carol wasn't just a petty dictator. She had power, influence, and a knack for manipulation, but Jake wasn't backing down. Jake's next move was bold. He decided to call Carol's bluff. He invited the community to his house for a party, but this wasn't just any gathering. This time, Carol would see that she had met her match. As the day of the party approached, Jake's anger simmered beneath the surface. He'd already begun to make legal moves, gathering evidence, and preparing for the court battle. But this party would be the final straw. He invited Mike and several neighbors who had been affected by Carol's reign. The invite wasn't just to have a good time. It was to show Carol that he wasn't going to back down. This time, Carol would be the one caught off guard. The day arrived, and the backyard was filled with the sound of laughter and music. Jake had set the scene, the perfect backyard barbecue with family and friends mingling, drinks flowing, and the delicious scent of grilled food in the air. He knew Carol wouldn't be able to resist. She thrived on confrontation, and he was giving her the opportunity to come knocking. Sure enough, around mid-afternoon, Jake spotted Carol marching down the street. She looked furious, her face set in a scowl. Her clipboard was clutched tightly in her hand, her posture rigid with authority. She approached Jake's house like a military officer on a mission, and as she reached the front door, she didn't even bother with pleasantries. "This is a blatant violation of HOA policy," she shrieked, waving the papers in the air. "You've been warned repeatedly. You are in gross violation of our regulations." Jake took a sip of his drink, deliberately ignoring her. "Carol, do you even hear yourself? You've got no authority here." Her face twisted with fury. "This party, this flouting of the rules is a direct slap in the face to everything we've worked for in this neighborhood." Mike, standing off to the side, stepped forward with calm confidence. "Actually, Carol, you don't have the legal right to enforce anything here. Jake's property isn't even under your jurisdiction." Carol froze, her mouth hanging open. Mike pulled out a stack of legal documents and handed them to her. "You're harassing my client, Carol. This isn't about the HOA anymore. You're breaking the law." The crowd watched in silence as Mike outlined the case. Carol's illegal actions, the abuse of power, and the extortion she had perpetrated. "You don't get to bully people just because you think you're in charge." Carol's confidence crumbled as she realized what was happening. The game had changed. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he walked out of the courthouse, the legal papers clutched tightly in his hand. For the first time since this whole debacle began, he allowed himself to breathe. Carol's reign of terror was over. The judge had made his ruling, and it was nothing short of a total victory. "All fines and violations against Jake were officially null and void," declared the judge. But it didn't stop there. The HOA had not only overstepped its authority, but it had also subjected Jake to harassment and intimidation. As a result, the HOA was now ordered to pay Jake $10,000 for emotional distress and legal fees. He could barely keep the grin off his face as he left the courtroom. Jake walked into his home, the faint buzz of his phone ringing on the counter. He picked it up, and a message flashed on the screen from Diane. "The neighborhood meeting's tomorrow. We need you there." Jake had no doubt what that meeting would be about. It was time for Cedar Ridge to take back control of their community, to reclaim their rights from the HOA that had stripped them of their freedom. At the meeting, the atmosphere was tense. Carol, still holding on to some semblance of authority, sat at the front with a defiant expression. But Jake noticed something different. Carol wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore. Neighbors who had once cowered in fear of her were speaking up. Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had been fined for his garden gnomes, stood up and raised his voice. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't care about the rules anymore. Carol and her little clique have ruined this neighborhood. I've lived here for 40 years, and it's never been like this. We were better before." The room erupted into applause. Neighbors, emboldened by Jake's victory, were no longer afraid to stand up. Carol, sitting at the front, visibly shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. Then the unthinkable happened. A woman named Linda, who had always supported Carol, stood up. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room. But Jake didn't feel sorry for her. He had witnessed firsthand the damage Carol had caused to the community, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The final humiliation came just a few days later. Jake was sitting on his front porch, enjoying a quiet evening, when he saw something across the street. There was a garage sale set up at Carol's house. But it wasn't the kind of sale one throws when they're downsizing for fun. It was a fire sale. Desperate, final, and humiliating. Carol was selling off her furniture, her antique collections, everything she had once paraded around with such pride. Jake watched her haggle over a $10 toaster, her once immaculate hair now disheveled, her expression tight with frustration. He smiled to himself. Karma had come knocking, and it was sweet. Jake wasn't the only one who'd won. The entire neighborhood had. For the first time, Cedar Ridge was free from the grip of a petty tyrant. The following week, there were for sale signs in front of Carol's house. She was packing up and leaving her power stripped away by the very people she had tried to control. Jake sat back, the cool breeze from the mountains sweeping across his porch. He could hear the laughter of children from down the street, neighbors chatting as they watered their lawns, and for the first time in a long while, the sound of true community. Cedar Ridge was back. He raised his glass to the victory, not just his, but for everyone who had fought back against Carol's reign of terror. The battle was won, and as Jake looked out over the quiet neighborhood, he realized that sometimes the best revenge wasn't just winning. It was seeing someone like Carol fall from grace. As he took another sip of his beer, he leaned back in his chair and thought, the best parties are the ones where the biggest surprise is a lawyer. And in Cedar Ridge, that surprise had been a game changer.